Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. Today we return once again to the events of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. At the heart of the story lies the legendary Triwizard tournament, a competition between three magical schools where each champion must prove their skill by surviving dangerous challenges. Harry unexpectedly found himself in the middle of it all, and while the tournament fits well into the dynamic plot of the book, many of its elements are, to say the least, confusing. Let us break down the strangest and most illogical parts of this magical event. Number 1. A flawed registration system. To enter the tournament, all someone has to do is toss a piece of parchment with a name into the goblet. That is it. No check for intent, no verification of consent. What if someone did it as a prank and put in someone else's name? For example, Draco Malfoy could have easily asked a senior student to drop Harry's name in. Why does the goblet not confirm the candidate's will? Why is there no consent charm? This is not a proper selection system. It is a dangerous, magical lottery. Number 2. What if Harry had just said no? Here comes one of the most intriguing questions. What if Harry had refused to participate? He did not put his name in. He was not of age. His name was submitted by someone else using trickery. So why did the contract take effect? Who is truly bound? The person who entered the name or the one named? If Harry never gave his consent, then this is not a magical agreement. This is forced involvement under the cover of tradition. Number 3, why was the tournament brought back? The big question is why the tournament was revived at all. It was shut down in 1792 after a deadly accident involving a basilisk. Since then, it was seen as a brutal and outdated custom. Then suddenly, in 1994, someone decided to throw teenagers into life-threatening trials once again. Why not create an inter-school Quidditch championship instead? It would be safe, exciting, and still competitive. But no, they brought back an old, undeniably deadly format. Is the magical world really this short on new ideas? Number 4, a spectacle with no spectators. The tournament was promoted as the event of the year. They even cancelled Hogwarts' usual Quidditch Cup for it. But was it truly watchable? The first task involved dragons, dramatic and intense. The audience witnessed real danger, but the second task took place underwater. People stared at the lake surface for an hour. No action. The third task was a massive maze hidden from view. Spectators sat guessing what might be happening inside. This was supposed to be the grand magical event. It felt more like a secret training drill than a public competition. Number 5. Why cancel Quidditch? Quidditch is beloved by both students and fans. Every school has its team, its energy, its excitement. So why cancel the entire season? Sure, Harry and Cedric could not play, but that is not a reason to call off the whole sport. They could have adjusted the schedule or held the finals earlier. Instead, they scrapped it entirely, as if the organizers just wanted less work. Narratively, focusing on the tournament made sense, but from a school administration perspective, it was a lazy and questionable move. Number 6, a contract full of holes. One of the main foundations of the tournament is the magical binding contract. Once the goblet selects your name, you must compete, no exceptions. That is how Harry got involved, but then strange things happen. Fleur backs out during the second task and Hunt eats, and nothing happens. In the third task, any champion can simply raise a wand and exit. So what is the point of this magical contract if it has no consequences? It seems like a threat that only exists in theory, and that is a major logical gap. Number 7, only one winner. Fleur saved no one in the second task and nearly drowned. Crumb used questionable magic in the maze. Harry consistently showed bravery and selflessness, saving not just Ron but also Gabrielle, a girl he had no obligation to help. Cedric showed fairness by warning Harry about the dragons and insisting they grab the cup together. Throughout the tournament, the judges awarded points. Ludo Bagman handed them out like candy, while Karkaroff docked Harry for breathing. But in the end, none of it mattered, because the winner wasn't decided by points. It was decided by who touched a cup first. The entire scoring system was meaningless. A champion could dominate the first 2 tasks, only to trip on a magical route in the maze and lose it all. What was the point? It's a test of courage, intelligence, and skill, they said. Then why reduce it to a foot race in the final moments? Cedric and Harry reached the cup together. They had tied in spirit, in performance, and in fairness, and yet only one name could be engraved on the victory plaque. The rules of the tournament honoured speed, not heart. It was never about who deserved to win. It was about who got there first. Number 12, the Ministry's total inaction. Cedric Diggory's body hit the ground with a lifeless thud. Moments earlier, he was smiling, holding the Triwizard cup. Then came a flash of green light, Avada Kedavra. When Harry returned from the graveyard, clutching Cedric's corpse and shaking with shock, the entire Hogwarts courtyard froze. There should have been a storm of questions, action, protection. Instead, there was silence. And from the Ministry of Magic? A shrug and a weak inquiry. Cornelius Fudge arrived not with sympathy, but with denial. Fudge stood over Cedric's body and refused to hear the truth. "He's not back," he said about Voldemort. "He can't be." Even as Dumbledore insisted Voldemort had returned in physical form, even as Harry recounted how Peter Pettigrew had used Harry's blood to resurrect the Dark Lord, the minister looked for excuses. "The boy is disturbed," Fudge muttered. Not a single aura was sent to investigate the graveyard. No tracking spells, no memory extractions, just a desperate attempt to bury the truth. It wasn't as if there hadn't been warning signs. Barty Crouch Jr., a convicted Death Eater, had infiltrated Hogwarts under a stolen identity. He manipulated the entire tournament. The real Alastor Moody had been locked in a trunk for months. Fudge was told everything by Dumbledore, by Snape, by McGonagall, yet his response was to cover it up. "We must not cause a panic," he said. But panic had already taken root in every student's heart. Cedric's death was proof that darkness had returned, and the Ministry's refusal to act was its own betrayal. Instead of uniting the magical world against a threat, Fudge began a campaign of silencing. He sent Dolores Umbridge to Hogwarts. He printed lies in the Daily Prophet. He branded Dumbledore a liar, Harry a delusional boy. "You know who is not back," he insisted, but everyone at Hogwarts had already seen the truth. And the Ministry's inaction didn't just cost time, it cost trust, it cost lives. Number 13, how could you fake the age line? Fred and George Weasley stood at the edge of the shimmering golden line, grinning like mischievous cats. In their hands, vials of aging potion. "Ready?" Fred asked. George nodded. They stepped over the line, hoping to trick Dumbledore's enchantment and enter the Triwizard tournament. What followed was pure chaos. Both were hurled backward, their hair turned snowy white, and long beards burst from their chins. The great hall roared with laughter. It was funny, but looking back it raises an unsettling question. Was Dumbledore's supposedly unbreakable age line that easy to bypass? The aging potion is hardly some ancient dark art. It's a standard item in magical learning. The fact that two teenage pranksters had access to it, unsupervised, should have triggered alarms. If the Weasleys could make the potion, what about seventh years? What about adult wizards with real skills and dangerous intentions? If the age line was designed to protect the goblet from underage applicants, why was its defense so casual that it became a joke? "Nice try," Dumbledore said with a twinkle in his eye. "But is that the reaction you give when magical security fails?" Even more curious is the goblet's own behavior. The Weasley twins failed to cross the line, but Barty Crouch Jr., impersonating Mad-Eye Moody, managed to bypass every safeguard. He tricked the goblet into accepting a fourth name, Harry Potter's, and not just that, he tricked it into thinking Harry belonged to a fourth school. "He hoodwinked a very powerful magical object," Dumbledore later exclaimed. But how? If the goblet was smart enough to recognize age and school affiliation, how did it miss such a blatant forgery? The Weasleys' prank now feels less like a joke and more like a warning. If Dumbledore's protections could be mocked by schoolboys and the goblet fooled by a Death Eater, what was the point of the rules at all? The Triwizard tournament was supposed to be sacred. secure, reserved for those of age and chosen by fate. Instead, it was manipulated from the inside, and no one noticed until it was too late. Number 14. Hagrid and the Dragons, a safe choice. No one with a clear understanding of Hogwarts staff would ever question Hagrid's love for magical creatures, nor would they deny his loyalty, kindness, and unshakable enthusiasm for anything with scales, fangs, or a potential to burn someone's eyebrows off. But when the first task of the prestigious and deadly Triwizard tournament was revealed to involve dragons, 4 fully grown, fire-breathing dragons, one could not help but raise an eyebrow at the choice of handler. Rubeus Hagrid, beloved keeper of keys and grounds at Hogwarts, was placed in charge of securing and managing the most lethal magical creatures in Britain for a task designed to test the survival skills of teenagers. There is something fundamentally troubling about this decision. The Triwizard tournament had returned after a century-long ban. Its reputation for death and disaster was the very reason for its disappearance, and its revival came with an assurance of enhanced safety protocols. Bartemius Crouch Sr., stern and rule-bound, personally oversaw the tournament's reinstatement under the International Confederation of Wizards. Ludo Bagman, less rigid but still representing the Ministry, also played a public role in the games, and yet somehow when it came to selecting someone to coordinate the most dangerous part of the first task, everyone looked to Hagrid, the same man who once smuggled a baby dragon into the school and nearly lost a hand trying to pet a blast-ended Scroot. The Scroots are, in fact, a telling example. Hagrid bred them himself in his hut, hybrids of manticores and fire crabs, 2 species so volatile they are classified under Class B, dangerous, and requires specialist knowledge. The result? Creatures that stung, exploded, grew to 6 feet long, and had no clear anatomy. They killed each other in captivity, were impossible to control, and Hagrid insisted on using them for care of magical creatures classes. The incident was so poorly received that Professor Grubbly Plank was brought in to replace him temporarily. McGonagall didn't hide her disapproval. It's no wonder that when Hagrid's eyes sparkled at the mention of dragons, anyone with common sense should have started writing letters to the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes. Yet, there he was, leading Harry under his invisibility cloak to the edge of the Forbidden Forest, proudly showing off 4 massive dragons in iron enclosures. "Norbert was just a baby," he whispered fondly, referring to the Norwegian ridgeback he once tried to raise in secret before it bit Ron and set fire to his hut. That incident alone should have disqualified him from ever handling dragons again, but instead of being banned from dragon-related duties, Hagrid was rewarded with the responsibility of coordinating an international magical event involving these apex predators. Even Professor McGonagall, typically composed and controlled, appeared aghast when she realized the task involved dragons. Her lips thinned dangerously, and her tone carried an edge when she addressed Crouch Sr. about the danger. In Goblet of Fire, she said, "Are you sure this is wise, Barty?" That question, sharp and unadorned, hovered over the entire spectacle. Wise? It was madness. If the students were risking their lives against dragons, the least the organizers could have done was ensure the creatures were handled by qualified professionals. And that brings us to the heart of the matter. Why wasn't a team from the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures brought in? This division of the Ministry has an entire subsection devoted to dragons, the Dragon Research and Restraint Bureau. It is staffed by wizards and witches with decades of experience in handling dangerous beasts, many of whom have trained at institutions like the Romanian Dragon Sanctuary, where Charlie Weasley works. Charlie himself, an ex-Hogwarts student, Quidditch captain, and now dragon handler, would have been a far more logical choice. Not only is he competent, but he also has the respect of his peers and a record of working with dragons safely. In fact, Charlie and his team did arrive to help transport the dragons. They used stunning spells and heavy iron restraints, but once the dragons were inside the Hogwarts grounds, they were turned over to Hagrid. Why? Did Dumbledore overrule Ministry procedure out of personal loyalty? Or was it simply easier to hand things over to the gamekeeper than to question the oddities of Hogwarts' internal operations? Dumbledore's role in this decision deserves closer scrutiny. The headmaster is known for trusting those whom others overlook. Snape, Trelawney, even Lupin, a werewolf. In Hagrid's case, the trust went far beyond employment. Dumbledore not only reinstated Hagrid after his expulsion, but also made him part of the faculty. It's an act of grace, yes, but also of consistent leniency. The same leniency that allowed Hagrid to continue endangering students through sheer lack of judgment, the same leniency that gave him full authority over the first task's most volatile element. One must ask, was it sentimentality? Was the Hogwarts staff so accustomed to Hagrid's eccentricities that they simply overlooked the dangers? Did anyone pause to consider what might happen if one of the dragons broke free, or if Hagrid, in his enthusiasm, allowed a champion too close during the preparation phase? The reality is, lives were at risk. These were 17-year-olds, most barely equipped with advanced defensive spells, and the first task was to outwit a creature whose breath could melt steel. A mishandling of the dragon during feeding, transport, or staging could have turned into a catastrophe long before the task officially began. Hagrid's relationship with dangerous creatures is deeply personal. His affinity is emotional, not professional. In Chamber of Secrets, he tries to defend Aragog, a giant acromantula, by saying he wouldn't hurt a soul. Moments later, Aragog tries to eat Harry and Ron. This kind of blindness to danger is consistent. Hagrid doesn't see threat, he sees misunderstood beauty. That's commendable in a classroom setting, perhaps with nifflers or hippogriffs under supervision, but with dragons, it borders on dereliction of duty. Number 15, no one noticed. Moody wasn't Moody. There is a moment in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire that nags at the mind long after the final page is turned. A moment so deeply embedded in the plot and yet so jarringly illogical that it demands revisiting. How could no one, not a single professor, student, or member of the Order have realized that Alastor Mad-Eye Moody wasn't Alastor Moody at all? The entire school had accepted this gruff, paranoid ex-Auror into their classrooms without resistance, and yet any true follower of Alastor Moody's career, or even a casual acquaintance, would have noticed the cracks. He was a man known for his sharp instincts, his distrustful nature, and his commitment to doing things by the book. But the man who taught defense against the dark arts that year was a volatile mixture of cruelty, recklessness, and warped morality. Still no one questioned him. From the moment he stormed into the Great Hall, slamming his staff with an unceremonious bang, the castle welcomed him without suspicion. But as the year unfolded, there were signs. So many signs. During his first class with the fourth years, the supposed Moody performed all 3 unforgivable curses on living creatures, on spiders, in front of children. "You need to know what you're up against. You need to be prepared," he barked. But the real Moody, the one who once took down Death Eaters and refused to compromise even under political pressure, would never have so flagrantly violated ministry regulations in a school setting. Minerva McGonagall, who had stood as the moral compass of the castle on many occasions, was shocked. She objected immediately after the lesson. But that was the end of it. No further action was taken. Dumbledore, who had spent decades carefully watching over the school and shielding it from corruption, turned a blind eye. Why? Even Moody's physical appearance had changed. Yes, Polyjuice Potion replicates appearance, but the eye, that eye, the enchanted electric blue orb that rotated 360 degrees, seemed to move differently. It twitched, glitched, and at times even saw through things it shouldn't have, almost as if it were out of sync with the man himself. Ron Weasley once commented that it had stared right through the back of his skull. That kind of magic isn't easily mimicked. If anything, it should have raised a flag. The way this faux Moody spoke of the dark arts was another red flag. He seemed to revere them, to admire their power, even as he warned against them. He encouraged Harry to break rules, to act independently of authority. "Play to your strengths, Potter," he growled in private. It wasn't advice, it was manipulation. The real Moody would never have taken such a personal interest in grooming a student for a deadly tournament. And yet Harry, who had learned not to trust anyone blindly, accepted this mentorship without hesitation. Even after being betrayed by Quirrell, tricked by Lockhart, and misled by Lupin, though unintentionally, he placed his faith in Moody. "He's all right, he's a bit mad, but he knows what he's doing," Harry said once. But was this blindness a result of trauma or the subtle charm of Barty Crouch Jr.'s performance? Then there was Snape. No fan of Moody, certainly. Their mutual disdain was no secret. One would imagine that Snape, master of legilimency and lifelong Slytherin skeptic, would have seen through the disguise. He'd known the real Moody during the First Wizarding War. He'd worked under his gaze. And yet not once does Snape seem to question this unstable impostor. Did Snape, for all his insight, simply not care? Or was there something more deliberate at play? Filch, too, who famously distrusted every professor since the days of Dumbledore's youth, never reported strange activity, not even when Moody roamed the castle at night, peering into classrooms, trailing students. Was it the authority of the Aura's name that paralyzed everyone's doubts, or was there a deeper culture of silence in Hogwarts, a dangerous willingness to ignore the uncomfortable? Even more baffling is the absence of reaction from the Order of the Phoenix. Sirius Black, Remus Lupin, and Arthur Weasley all had personal ties to the real Moody. None of them raised the question. When Sirius briefly communicates with Harry via fireplace, he gives no warning. He never says, "If Moody seems different, let me know." But wouldn't he have wanted to check in on an old comrade's welfare? Perhaps most ironic is the memory of the previous year, when students and staff alike were quick to accuse Lupin of harboring dark secrets. The moment Snape revealed his identity as a werewolf, the castle recoiled. But this time, the supposed Moody, a man behaving in openly aggressive, borderline illegal ways, was granted the benefit of the doubt. Why the change? Hogwarts had once been a place of vigilance. In Prisoner of Azkaban, the staff launched a school-wide alert when Sirius was merely suspected of entering the grounds. Dementors were called in, passwords were changed, fat lady portraits were slashed. But now a stranger slept under their roof, wearing the face of a man they respected, and no one thought to ask why he was just a little off. The impostor even had close contact with Dumbledore on multiple occasions. He joined staff meetings. He stood at the head table. He was consulted during the Triwizard tournament. At no point did Dumbledore, the most intuitive wizard of the age, sense a discrepancy. This, perhaps, is the most unsettling part of all. The headmaster, who could detect the slightest hint of darkness in Tom Riddle, failed to see through a mask worn by one of Voldemort's most fanatical followers. It was a perfect crime, but only because no one was watching. The Polyjuice potion required constant maintenance. The impostor had to steal hair from the real Moody on a regular basis, keep him hidden, and manage his own teaching duties without slipping. And yet not one person ever stumbled into the wrong room. No house elf accidentally discovered the real Moody. No curious student got lost near the trunk that held him. A school filled with nosy teenagers and magical surveillance, and the disguise held strong. Number 16, the second task's purposeful vagueness. Of all the thrilling and bizarre moments in the Triwizard tournament, one lingers like a shadow in the minds of those who dare to look beyond the glamour and into the darker folds of magical tradition. The second task, an underwater rescue set in the icy depths of the Hogwarts Black Lake. A challenge designed to test bravery, magical resourcefulness, and emotional resilience. But buried beneath its kelp-draped surface lies a question few dare to raise. Why did the tournament organizers choose to hide the true nature of the task from the champions? Why keep secret the identities of the hostages, their most treasured people, until the moment of confrontation? As the champions prepared for the event, they were given only one cryptic clue. Harry's egg, when opened underwater, produced a chilling song from the Mer people. "We've taken what you'll sorely miss." That's it. No names, no hints, just an ominous verse wrapped in cold mystery. The The champions, Harry Potter, Cedric Diggory, Fleur Delacour, and Victor Crumb, were left to guess what form this precious thing might take. Might it be an object, a memory, a person? Could it even be something more abstract like a fear or a secret? The riddle's vagueness created not a challenge rooted in logic, but a trap woven in emotional manipulation. For Harry, the uncertainty was maddening. In Goblet of Fire, the days before the second task are a haze of anxiety. He doesn't just worry about breathing underwater, he obsesses over who might be taken. Would it be Ron, his best friend? Hermione, the sister-in-arms he trusted more than anyone? Even Hedwig or Sirius crossed his mind. It was more than training or preparation, it was dread. And not the good kind, the kind that sharpens a blade before battle. This was paralyzing fear. What if they've taken Ron? Harry thinks more than once. And what if he fails? What if his friend drowns in the black water while he fumbles with spells and half-brewed gillyweed? The organisers, it seems, wanted it that way. Ludo Bagman, Barty Crouch Sr., and even Dumbledore remained silent. Not a whisper of reassurance was offered, not even to the guardians of the kidnapped students, not to Molly Weasley, who adored her son Ron, not to Madame Maxime, Fleur's headmistress, not even to the teachers, many of whom likely knew little or nothing of the plan. The safety of the hostages was assumed, yet never confirmed. And this raises a disturbing question. What if one of the champions had failed? Would the Mer people truly have let the hostage die? Or, as Dumbledore later claims, were they always safe? But the point is not what the judges planned. The point is what the champions believed. And therein lies the heart of the issue. Harry believed, with every heartbeat, that he was diving into the abyss to save Ron from death. Fleur, desperate to rescue her sister Gabrielle, panicked when she could not complete the task. Victor Crumb's face twisted with fear as he realized Hermione might be lost forever if he faltered. The emotional manipulation was complete. They weren't being tested on magic, they were being tested on whether they'd allow the people they loved to die. Let us pause here and consider. This is a school competition. Hogwarts was not a battlefield. The champions were teenagers. The youngest, Harry, had just turned 14. Even Cedric, the oldest, was still a student. And yet they were led to believe that their loved ones had been abducted and imprisoned beneath an icy lake by non-human creatures. The supposed reassurance that the hostages were never in real danger is never offered to the participants before the task, nor is it given in the moment when it might have alleviated their terror. Instead, they're left to stew in dread. This silence was not a neutral choice, it was deliberate, a design element, a twist to enhance drama. But in what world is that justifiable? Imagine for a moment if Hermione had been told in advance, "You'll be taken to the lake, held safely, and your friend will have to find you." She'd worry, yes, but she would understand. Now imagine her being told nothing, waking to find herself bound beneath dark waters, waiting helplessly with no guarantee of rescue. Her trust in the school, in the system that taught her magic, was silently put on trial. Fleur's case highlights the absurdity of the secret even more starkly. She fails to complete the task and her sister remains underwater. Fleur emerges in tears, hysterical. "Gabrielle! Gabrielle! Is she alive?" she screams in panic. For those watching, it is an emotional moment. For Fleur, it is pure horror. For several unbearable minutes, she believes her sister has drowned. Only later is she told, gently and with indulgent smiles, that of course Gabrielle was never in danger. But the damage is done. Fleur's failure, her terror, her despair, they were real. And Harry? He doesn't just rescue Ron. He delays his return to the surface to try and save everyone, including Gabrielle. Even though it nearly costs him the task, he loses points for this, as the judges argue he wasted time. But what choice did he have? He believed, truly believed, that the others were about to die. "They're only sleeping," says one of the merpeople, but how was he supposed to know that? When Dumbledore eventually defends Harry's overachievement, the argument is made that Harry showed moral fibre, but isn't that just an after-the-fact justification for putting a child through an unnecessary emotional trial? There is a pattern in the Triwizard tournament, a sinister subtext beneath the flashy dragons and underwater rescues. Time and again the tasks are framed as educational, yet their cruelty is dismissed as tradition. The first task involved fire-breathing dragons, the second, the illusion of loss and potential death, the third, a maze that drives people mad. And throughout, the justification is always the same. This is how it has always been done. But does that make it right? If a magical ritual traumatizes its participants in the name of challenge, what is it really testing? Cedric's experience was no better. He had enough information to plan, enough time to brew a bubblehead charm, but he too had no idea who he'd be rescuing. When he reaches Cho Chang, his expression, calm outside but full of tension inside, says it all. He had prepared, yes, but not emotionally. Not for the sight of the girl he cared about floating like a statue beneath a lake, watched over by merpeople who spoke a language he could not understand. There's an almost callous arrogance in the way the judges smile and clap when the task ends. They hand out points as if awarding sweets at a fair, praising courage and penalizing delay. But who was evaluating them? Who was measuring the ethical line they crossed? Because it wasn't just about points, it was about trauma. It was about teaching children that fear, confusion, and emotional chaos were part of learning magic. Even Rita Skeeter, for all her sensationalism, never dared touch this nerve. She called Harry a liar, called Hermione manipulative, but never wrote an article questioning why the tournament was allowed to use human hostages. Why didn't the Daily Prophet investigate the silence around the second task? Why didn't anyone ask if consent was involved? Did the hostages agree to be bound and left unconscious? Did they have the right to refuse? Or were they simply chosen, their agency ignored, to serve as props in a magical morality play? We see the impact most clearly in the moments after the task. Harry doesn't celebrate. He coughs up lake water, exhausted and disoriented. Fleur is pale, shaken. Victor Krum tries to hide the fact that his hands are trembling. The surface may be calm, but the ripple effect of emotional disturbance runs deep. And perhaps most troubling of all is the fact that none of them are offered any counseling, no time to unpack what they just experienced. It's on to the next task, the next trial, no looking back. Dumbledore, the ever-wise headmaster, defends the structure of the tasks as necessary tests of character. But even his silence in this case feels questionable. This is the man who often speaks in riddles, who sees the long game. But did he too decide that fear was a better teacher than trust? Or did he quietly disagree but allow tradition to dictate the moment? It's never made clear, and perhaps that ambiguity is the most unsettling part of all. One can only imagine what McGonagall thought of it. A woman of stern discipline, yes, but also fierce care for her students. Did she approve of Harry being emotionally manipulated? Did she raise concerns that were overruled? We don't know. Her silence in this chapter is the silence of many. But that does not make it acceptable. Even Sirius Black, watching from afar in his cave, seems troubled when Harry recounts the task. He warns him to stay alert, to trust no one, but the warning comes too late. The damage, the lesson that those you love can be used against you has already been taught. And not by a Death Eater, but by a school-sanctioned tradition. The story of the second task, then, is not just about gillyweed and daring dives. It's a story of manipulation, of emotional warfare disguised as education. The champions were brave, yes, but they were also misled. And the fact that no one speaks of it afterward, no one questions the ethics of forcing a child to believe their friend might die if they fail, that silence speaks louder than any mermaid song. Would it have changed the outcome if they had known in advance? Perhaps not. Perhaps they would have tried just as hard. But it would have changed the nature of the test. It would have tested courage without cruelty. Magic, after all, is not meant to be heartless, and neither should be those who teach it. The second task, for all its spectacle, revealed an uncomfortable truth about the magical world. That even in places of learning, fear is sometimes mistaken for strength. And that is the real lesson we were never supposed to learn. Number 17. Sharing clues was apparently fine. The Triwizard tournament was not a game. It was not a classroom exercise or a friendly school competition. It was a test of magical prowess, bravery, cunning, and above all, resilience under pressure. Throughout its dark and storied history, it had taken lives and broken many more. Yet in the 1994-1995 revival of the tournament, a peculiar inconsistency emerged, one so glaring that it calls into question the very integrity of its framework. Why was Harry Potter, after discovering the first task would involve dragons, not only allowed to share this information with Cedric Diggory, but even praised for doing so? How can this be reconciled with the rules of a competition where secrecy was supposed to be paramount? The first task of the Triwizard tournament was deliberately shrouded in mystery. "The champions are not permitted to know what their tasks will be," stated Ludo Bagman, head of the Department of Magical Games and Sports. That decree was not merely ceremonial, it was designed to ensure fairness. If participants could prepare in advance, the element of genuine challenge, the very heart of the tournament, would be eroded. So why then, when Rubeus Hagrid walked Harry into the Forbidden Forest under the pretense of a stroll and showed him the chained dragons meant for the first task, was this not considered a breach? Hagrid's intentions may have been well-meaning, rooted in affection and worry for Harry, but the act itself was deeply problematic. He gave Harry a monumental advantage, prior knowledge of what he would face in the arena. It was a dragon, yes, but not just any dragon, but one of 4 terrifying breeds, each assigned randomly. Harry had time to think, to plan, to seek advice, which he did, from Sirius, and later from Moody, who was not even Moody. This foreknowledge granted him a layer of strategic calm the others were denied. He could simulate potential spells, rehearse tactics, and, most critically, summon his broom. The others had to improvise under the crushing pressure of ignorance. Then comes the turning point. Harry, though not compelled by rule, chose to inform Cedric Diggory of what he had learned. Cedric, the true Hogwarts champion, was in the dark. If Harry had remained silent, he would have retained a considerable edge, but instead he pulled Cedric aside and whispered to him that the first task involved dragons. Cedric was startled as expected, but grateful. And later, when word got around, what did Harry receive? A verbal pat on the back, praise for fairness and integrity. But this moment deserves far more scrutiny than it ever received. The rules of the tournament were never entirely clear, and therein lies the issue. Barty Crouch Sr., who had enforced a magically binding contract to keep Harry as a participant against his will, did not address Harry's leak of confidential information. Nor did Dumbledore, nor did Bagman. No reprimands, no penalties. By that logic, nothing would have prevented Harry from broadcasting all his findings to every champion, or even to the entire student body. Why not make a bulletin board in the Great Hall? Next task, dragons. Bring your broomsticks and don't forget to aim between the eyes. If secrecy was optional, why was it enforced in the first place? The entire scene, where the champions are kept apart and led into the arena one by one, was steeped in suspense and mystery. The audience was made to believe that what they were about to face was unknown, that their reactions would be spontaneous, that their skill would be tested raw. But that illusion collapses when we consider that 2 of the 4 champions had insider information. Victor Crumb and Fleur Delacour, both fierce competitors, were left disadvantaged through sheer honesty. They obeyed the implied rules. Cedric, thanks to Harry, was handed an answer sheet. When the event concluded, the scores were curiously close. Harry received high marks despite damaging the arena and nearly being killed. Cedric performed well too, but those scores were now tainted, influenced not only by skill but by quiet collaboration. The tournament had unwittingly become a cooperative game. This cooperation, though emotionally satisfying, diluted the core idea of the contest. Had the tables been turned and Cedric discovered the secret first, would he have shared it with Harry? The narrative never explores that possibility, nor does it challenge Harry's actions with any real force. Dumbledore's silence is perhaps the most troubling. The headmaster was not only aware of what Hagrid did, but also allowed Harry to act on it. In a moment that should have been followed by stern words, or a re-examination of protocol, Dumbledore turned a blind eye. He later defended Harry at every turn, even when other judges might have raised eyebrows. The favoritism, subtle though it was, undermines the impartiality expected of such a prestigious event. For all Dumbledore's speeches about fairness and the noble spirit of competition, he stood idle as Harry bent the rules. The contradiction is glaring because the tournament, as dangerous and dramatic as it was, functioned under the pretense of equality. Each task, be it dragon fighting, lake diving, or maze navigating, was meant to test unprepared brilliance. The champions entered blind like gladiators in a coliseum. To give even one of them a clue was to tilt the arena. Yet when Harry did just that, he was rewarded. A backwards message was sent that bending the rules, so long as it's done kindly, is not only forgivable, but admirable. This sends an even darker message when we consider the stakes. The tournament wasn't just about scoring points or winning a trophy. Lives were on the line. Every task came with mortal danger. Harry's foreknowledge could have saved him from serious injury, or worse. The same advantage, given to Cedric, may have kept him calm and precise. And what of Crumb and Fleur? Fleur was nearly taken down by a dragon she hadn't prepared for. Crumb had to act swiftly underwater without knowing what creatures lurked. Their ignorance was penalizing. The reader is asked to believe that Harry did the right thing, but the right thing under what law? Under what code? In the magical contract that bound the champions, was there a clause about ethics in sharing intelligence? If not, why not? And if yes, why wasn't it enforced? The book does not say. And this silence is deafening. He told me about the dragons, Cedric says to his fellow Hufflepuffs. He didn't have to. It was really decent of him. But decency does not equal fairness, and fairness is what the tournament was supposed to enshrine. It's also notable that Bagman secretly offered Harry help before the task, another break from the rules that went curiously unpunished. When Harry declined, Bagman simply shrugged it off. This tournament, cloaked in tradition and honor, was riddled with loopholes, and the biggest of all was that information was currency, yet only some were allowed to spend it. The ethical boundaries blurred. One champion could give away a secret and be lauded, another could accept help and be suspected of cheating. The arbiters of justice were inconsistent at best. Adding to the confusion is the fact that other students were explicitly not supposed to know about the tasks. Percy Weasley, speaking from his perch in the ministry, had stated that part of the spectacle came from the champion's ingenuity. If everyone knew what was coming, he argued, it would be no better than a rehearsed performance. Yet here we are, with Harry essentially delivering a spoiler and receiving applause. The spectators watched under the illusion that these feats were unrehearsed, an illusion shattered by Harry's unpunished disclosure. The most ironic part of all is that Harry was still seen as the underdog. Despite having inside knowledge, help from teachers, and magical tools others lacked, the narrative continued to paint him as alone and unprepared, but he was anything but. The truth is that Harry had the tools to succeed because the system bent around him. It bent for Dumbledore's favourite, for the boy who lived. And perhaps beneath the layers of drama and magic, that favouritism poisoned the tournament's credibility more than any spell could have. Mad-Eye Moody, really Barty Crouch Jr., was the only one who manipulated the tournament structure for calculated ends, but ironically, even his interference seemed more rule-bound than what others were allowed to do openly. His guidance to Harry, though unethical, was clandestine. Yet Hagrid's act of showing dragons to Harry was in full daylight. No polyjuice potion, no deception, just an open act of favoritism excused by emotion. Which is more dangerous to an institution, covert sabotage or institutional blindness? As the tournament progressed, its inconsistencies became harder to ignore. Each task layered on more contradictions. But the moment Harry shared the dragon clue and faced no consequences, a message was clearly broadcast. Rules are malleable, depending on who you are and how you present your actions. Intentions mattered more than impact, yet in a contest where students faced fire-breathing monsters, merpeople, and cursed mazes, impact should have been everything. This moment may be remembered by readers as a kind one, Harry helping Cedric. But when we strip away the sentimentality and look at the architecture of the tournament, we see a crack, and that crack widens when we ask why the organizers didn't stop him, reprimand him, or at the very least clarify the rules. If Harry had told all the champions, perhaps fairness would have prevailed, but singling out one created a private alliance, and in a solo competition, that's a betrayal of its design. In the end, Cedric died, not because of the clue or lack thereof, but because the tournament was a trap. A grand game turned into a stage for Voldemort's return. But that doesn't excuse the structural flaws that allowed inconsistency to breed. The organizers were negligent, the judges were biased, and Harry, though a hero in many respects, was permitted to stretch the rules in ways others could not. That's the real injustice buried under the smoke and spectacle. Would the outcome have been different if everyone had the same advantage? Perhaps not. But fairness isn't about the outcome, it's about the opportunity. And that opportunity was not equal. Harry's actions, though well-intentioned, broke the fragile illusion of a just competition, and no amount of praise can rebuild what was never truly fair to begin with. Number 18, real Moody, locked in a trunk for months. When the Triwizard tournament was announced in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, the magical world held its breath in excitement and nostalgia. It was a competition of courage, cunning, and magical might, resurrected under the illusion of safety. Yet one of the most perplexing inconsistencies in the entire saga was carefully packed away in a wooden trunk with 7 locks and never truly addressed again: the unexplained disappearance of Alastair Mad-Eye Moody. To impersonate such a paranoid, battle-hardened aura for an entire school year was no small feat. Barty Crouch Jr. used Polyjuice Potion, skillfully copying Mad-Eye's scarred visage, his electric blue magical eye, and even his gravelly impatience. But that only answers how he looked like Moody, not where the real one was. The answer? Locked in a magical trunk inside the very classroom from which Crouch taught defense against the dark arts. That's where the illusion begins to fall apart. The trunk was in the heart of Hogwarts, a school bustling with life and soaked in enchantments. Students roamed its halls, professors taught in its rooms. Dumbledore himself, known for his perceptiveness and suspicion, had access to every corner of the castle, and yet no one ever questioned why Alastair Moody, a man known for trusting no one, had sealed a magical trunk with 7 different locks and complex enchantments in a place meant to be shared with others. This isn't a question of oversight, it's a contradiction of logic in a world where magic reveals what the mundane conceals. In Goblet of Fire, when Harry stumbles across the real Moody inside the trunk, the narration describes the prison. There was a man lying on the floor at the bottom of a deep pit, illuminated by the beam of light shining through the open lid of the trunk. The man was emaciated, ragged, and barely coherent, trapped for 10 months, mere feet, from where Dumbledore and McGonagall occasionally stood. What's more, Alastair Moody was a known member of the Order of the Phoenix. Dumbledore had recruited him, trusted him, and surely expected more than a silent, unquestioning ally. Could Dumbledore, in all his omniscience, truly believe that Moody had suddenly abandoned his suspicious nature, taken a job at Hogwarts, and started guzzling Polyjuice Potion in his office to heal imaginary ailments without anyone questioning it? Crouch as Moody drank his Polyjuice openly. Moody took a swig from his hip flask, the book notes more than once. Not once did anyone find it suspicious that he constantly needed to replenish some private drink. Snape, ever watchful and always suspecting dark magic, never raised an eyebrow, even though he personally brewed the Polyjuice ingredients that mysteriously went missing from his private stores. This same Snape who, in Half-Blood Prince, could deduce the effects of a potion from its scent alone. But the real riddle lies not in what Crouch did, but in what everyone else failed to do. The trunk was a magical object of considerable complexity. It had 7 locks, each revealing a different compartment. Why did no curious student or nosy caretaker like Filch ever wonder what Moody was hiding? Why didn't Dumbledore or McGonagall, both deeply familiar with Moody's personality, ever question the presence of such an object in his classroom? In Prisoner of Azkaban, we're introduced to spells like Hominum Revelio, used to detect the presence of humans. Lupin, a less paranoid and less powerful wizard than Moody, took extraordinary precautions when he taught at Hogwarts, and still, his secret, that he was a werewolf, eventually came out. And yet no one used a simple detection spell in Moody's room, even when the man himself was visibly acting stranger than usual. Crouch's Moody did not merely act oddly. He was a caricature of what others imagined Moody to be. He had no backstory, no clear chain of contact with the outside world, no interactions with people he should have known personally. The real Moody would have surely had conversations with other Order members. Sirius, Remus Lupin, Kingsley Shacklebolt, they all had relationships with him. Why was there never a scene in which someone tried to meet with him outside class and noticed something was off? And then there is the matter of house elves. Dobby, Creature, and Winky all are aware of the nuances of people's identities, even when concealed by magic. Winky, in particular, had served Barty Crouch Sr. and by extension had been close to the events surrounding her master's downfall. It is never mentioned whether she suspected the impostor, but surely the presence of the real Moody trapped nearby would have resonated with any house elf with even a fraction of initiative. House elves can apparate and sense magical auras, and yet one of the greatest secrets of the school remained undiscovered by all of them. Furthermore, magical objects themselves seemed indifferent. The Marauders map, for instance, showed names of all people on Hogwarts grounds, regardless of magical disguise. Fred and George used it frequently in Prisoner of Azkaban. "We've been watching him on the map," they tell Harry. So did no one ever notice the name Barty Crouch Jr. standing in for Mad-Eye Moody? Or, even more damning, did no one notice Alastair Moody appearing in the same classroom, just from inside the trunk? The room of requirement, the forbidden forest, even the dungeons had secrets, but they were hidden in places no one ventured. Moody's trunk, however, sat plainly in the middle of a staff-accessible room. Even Hagrid, with his odd sense of curiosity and devotion to Dumbledore's missions, never found a reason to mention the aura's peculiar behavior. Yet he trusted Moody enough to collaborate on transporting Harry during the escape from Privet Drive a year later. When Harry opens the trunk and sees the real Moody, the horror is palpable, but it is also profoundly illogical. The real man had been fed Polyjuice Potion by his captor for 10 months. "He kept me alive," Moody croaks, "so he could keep taking hair from me." The logistics of this are disturbing. Did no one notice the smell of illness or the physical degradation emanating from a man kept barely alive in captivity? Did no house elf ever clean the room, stumble across a muffled sound, or notice the bizarre enchantments on the trunk? Magic in the Harry Potter universe has repeatedly been shown to react to the truth, not just appearances. The Goblet of Fire itself rejects those who do not meet its strict criteria. The Mirror of Erised shows only the truth of desire. Veritaserum compels truth from the unwilling, and yet Hogwarts, the most magical school in the world, allowed a man to be imprisoned under its nose for almost an entire year without triggering a single protective enchantment or raising a single wand in concern. Even more shocking is the finality with which the situation is resolved. After Crouch Jr. is unmasked, the real Moody is mentioned only briefly, convalescing and recovering. No teachers discuss the implications, no inquiry is held into the lapse of magical security. It is as though everyone quietly agreed to forget that one of their own had been held in a wooden coffin under magical lock and key for nearly a year in plain sight. This points to a greater inconsistency in how danger is detected, or more precisely, how it is ignored, when it no longer serves the central plot. For all its wonder, the magical world is shockingly unconcerned with protocol. There were no magical alarms to detect unauthorized polyjuice use, no routine security scans for impersonation, not even a rudimentary identity-checking charm when Dumbledore introduced Moody to the staff. Ironically, it is the very magical methods that could have exposed the truth that make the cover-up seem impossible. With legilimency, Snape could have uncovered the truth with a glance. With Fidelius, Moody could have protected himself. With Hominum Revelio, Dumbledore could have sensed him, but none of these were used. Why? The answer may lie in the narrative necessity of keeping the plot twist concealed until the climactic reveal. But from a logical standpoint within the world Rowling created, the failure to detect the real Moody's imprisonment borders on absurdity. If one Alohomora could open a lock on a trunk and uncover the most sinister deception of the entire tournament, then the foundation of magical security in Hogwarts is far shakier than we believed. In the end, the moment speaks less about the brilliance of Barty Crouch Jr. and more about the collective blindness of a magical community entranced by the illusion of safety. The most dangerous magic is not dark or forbidden, it's the kind that hides in plain sight, behind the locked compartments of a trunk, waiting to be opened by a boy who had no reason to suspect anything, yet uncovered everything. Number 19. Why was the goblet a portkey? The Triwizard tournament was never meant to be safe, but danger was supposed to come from dragons, mermaids, and magical mazes, not from the very prize the champions were meant to claim. The Triwizard Cup, shining and revered, symbolized not only victory but the culmination of magical strength, intellect, and bravery. And yet within its gleaming silver frame lay one of the most dangerous deceptions ever conjured in Hogwarts history. Somehow it was transformed into a portkey, an object of instantaneous transportation which would carry Harry Potter and Cedric Diggory to a graveyard soaked in death and dark magic. The question haunts the scene like a phantom. How did no one notice? The cup sat at the heart of the third task, its silhouette rising from the hedges like a beacon of success. Students watched from stands, professors monitored from the perimeter, and champions navigated deadly challenges for the chance to lay a hand on its handles. But who enchanted it? And more troubling, how could no one detect the enchantment? Magical objects in the wizarding world are not simple baubles. The Department of Magical Games and Sports, which oversaw the Triwizard tournament, operated under strict regulations. Bartemius Crouch Sr. had laid out the tournament's framework, and although he disappeared before the final task, surely his colleagues, Ludo Bagman among them, should have inspected the most critical object of the entire contest. Why was the cup, the literal endpoint of the maze, not examined with the same caution as the Goblet of Fire? The Goblet of Fire, after all, had been surrounded by protective enchantments. Dumbledore himself described it as a very powerful magical object that could not be tampered with easily. They made a point of warning students to stay away from the goblet. It was placed in the Great Hall and watched vigilantly until the champions were chosen. And yet, when the final task approached, when the real lives of students would be at risk, a shining cup was placed in the maze without even a cursory check. Not by Dumbledore, not by Professor McGonagall, and not even by Mad-Eye Moody, who ironically was no more than Barty Crouch Jr. in disguise. It defies logic. We are told that Moody, Crouch Jr., using Polyjuice Potion, was the one who turned the cup into a portkey. According to his own confession, it was a simple thing to turn a trophy into a portkey. Simple perhaps for a skilled Death Eater, but what about the rest of the magical community? What about the professors at Hogwarts, the ministry officials? Magical interference, especially on objects tied to major public events, should have sent a ripple through any detection charms in place. Was there no protocol? Did no one think to scan the cup before placing it in front of an audience of hundreds? Let us consider the nature of a portkey. It requires very specific enchantments: location, activation method, timing, and user target. Turning an ordinary item into a portkey is no simple matter if the intent is secrecy. The charm used, Portus, leaves a magical trace. In Order of the Phoenix, Dumbledore performs this spell to convert a worn-out kettle into a portkey, and it glows blue. Such magic is not invisible. So how, under the noses of Albus Dumbledore, Professor Flitwick, a master of charms, and others, did such a spell remain undetected? One could argue that Crouch Jr. was an expert at deceit. But expertise in disguise does not equate to invulnerability to magical detection. This was Hogwarts, possibly the most enchanted and warded location in the wizarding world. If the cup had been tampered with, surely the wards would have flared, and still nothing. Harry and Cedric touched it and vanished without a sound. When Dumbledore realizes what has happened, he shouts, "He's back, Voldemort's back." But even in the shock of Voldemort's return, the fundamental question remains. How could such a colossal breach of security go unnoticed? There is something deeply unsettling about the negligence shown here. The magical community prides itself on rules, especially where students are concerned. Apparition lessons require ministry oversight. Time turners are locked in the Department of Mysteries. And yet a tournament involving dangerous magical tasks entrusted its final artifact to fate. No spell of detection, no curse analysis, no anti-portkey measure. Perhaps the only plausible explanation is that Crouch Jr., posing as Moody, was given unfettered access to the cup. He had already manipulated the Goblet of Fire to accept a fourth name. He orchestrated events with disturbing precision, placing the imperious curse on Victor Crumb, stunning Fleur Delacour, and leading Harry through a cleared maze. But this only raises the stakes of the question. If one man could operate under Dumbledore's nose with such precision, what does that say about the institution's safeguards? Dumbledore, for all his wisdom, admitted his failure in this moment. When he meets Harry after the graveyard escape, he does not protest the boy's tale. He says grimly, "I will take Harry upstairs. There is a lot to discuss." But he never addresses, at least not in the open, how such a basic safety check was skipped. One could argue that Dumbledore had grown used to working independently, trusting his own instincts. But trust, in this case, became a blindfold. The story becomes darker when one considers the human cost. Cedric Diggory, a promising, kind-hearted Hufflepuff, was murdered mere seconds after arriving at the graveyard. He had touched the cup believing he'd won a fair contest. Instead, he was pulled into a murder trap. The object meant to honor his triumph became the doorway to his death. Was no one accountable for this? The irony is unbearable. The Triwizard Cup, held high as a symbol of unity between three magical schools, became an instrument of evil. Its transformation was not a symbolic twist, it was a literal perversion of meaning, and not one adult intervened, not a single magical trace was questioned, not one charm examined. If this had been a tale of muggles, perhaps the oversight would be understandable, but in a world where wands reveal truth and spells unveil lies, the silence around the cup's transformation becomes its own kind of curse. Let us recall how fiercely Hogwarts protected the Philosopher's Stone just 3 years prior. A sequence of deadly enchantments was layered over its hiding place: Fluffy, Devil's Snare, enchanted keys, a life-sized chessboard, all for an object no student knew existed, and yet the Triwizard Cup, an object every eye was trained upon, received none of this scrutiny. Where were the enchantments, the deterrents, the simple spells to verify its state? Even the Quidditch World Cup, meant for entertainment, was not without its own layers of security. There were protective enchantments, anti-apparition fields, and protocols for muggle concealment. When Death Eaters attacked, it was seen as a major breakdown in magical security. And yet that disaster was met with more urgency and investigation than the sabotage of a student tournament. Why was this breach tolerated with such relative quiet? Harry's account, as described in Goblet of Fire, is chilling. "The cup was a portkey," he says, bloodied and shaking. There is no follow-up from ministry officials demanding an explanation. Cornelius Fudge brushes off the return of Voldemort, but even he must have known that a portkey was not an accident. Someone cast the spell, someone set the destination. Why was that someone not immediately identified and prosecuted? Crouch Jr.'s later confession under Veritaserum provides the only glimpse into how the enchantment was performed. "I made it a portkey," he says. Simple words for a complex betrayal. But if Veritaserum reveals the truth, it should have sparked broader outrage. If a Death Eater could alter a critical magical object inside Hogwarts, what else could be changed? Was there ever a re-evaluation of magical protocols? It is worth noting how quickly the Triwizard Tournament vanished after this. There were no more editions. The cup, once a symbol of magical unity, was quietly removed from future curricula. It was as if the wizarding world hoped to forget the fatal flaw, the moment where arrogance outpaced wisdom. Hogwarts rebuilt. But the memory of a shining cup, its silver light hiding deadly magic, never left Harry, nor should it leave us. The Triwizard Cup's dark transformation is more than a plot twist. It is a narrative betrayal of logic. It asks the reader to accept that the most significant object in a deadly game was the least protected. It demands belief that a school famed for its vigilance allowed a trap to bloom in full view. And worst of all, it makes Cedric Diggory's death seem not like the work of one man, but the result of collective negligence. The boy who died holding a prize deserved better, and so the cup remains a question mark in a story filled with wonder. A reminder that even in a world of magic, oversight is not immune to failure. Perhaps that's what makes this moment in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire so quietly terrifying. Not the spell, not even Voldemort, but the silence around a cup that glowed with promise and delivered a nightmare instead. Number 20. How did Harry and Cedric arrive at the same time? The Triwizard Tournament was never meant to be safe, but danger was supposed to come from dragons, mermaids, and magical mazes, not from the very prize the champions were meant to claim. The Triwizard Cup, shining and revered, symbolized not only victory but the culmination of magical strength, intellect, and bravery. And yet, within its gleaming silver frame lay one of the most dangerous deceptions ever conjured in Hogwarts history. Somehow it was transformed into a portkey, an object of instantaneous transportation which would carry Harry Potter and Cedric Diggory to a graveyard soaked in death and dark magic. The question haunts the scene like a phantom. How did no one notice? The cup sat at the heart of the third task, its silhouette rising from the hedges like a beacon of success. Students watched from stands, professors monitored from the perimeter, and champions navigated deadly challenges for the chance to lay a hand on its handles. But who enchanted it? And, more troubling, how could no one detect the enchantment? Magical objects in the wizarding world are not simple baubles. The Department of Magical Games and Sports, which oversaw the Triwizard Tournament, operated under strict regulations. Bartemius Crouch Sr. had laid out the tournament's framework, and although he disappeared before the final task, surely his colleagues, Ludo Bagman among them, should have inspected the most critical object of the entire contest. Why was the cup, the literal endpoint of the maze, not examined with the same caution as the Goblet of Fire? The Goblet of Fire, after all, had been surrounded by protective enchantments. Dumbledore himself described it as a very powerful magical object that could not be tampered with easily. They made a point of warning students to stay away from the goblet. It was placed in the Great Hall and watched vigilantly until the champions were chosen. And yet, when the final task approached, when the real lives of students would be at risk, a shining cup was placed in the maze without even a cursory check. Not by Dumbledore, not by Professor McGonagall, and not even by Mad Eye Moody, who ironically was no more than Barty Crouch Jr. in disguise. It defies logic. We are told that Moody, Crouch Jr., using Polyjuice Potion, was the one who turned the cup into a portkey. According to his own confession, it was a simple thing to turn a trophy into a portkey. Simple perhaps for a skilled Death Eater, but what about the rest of the magical community? What about the professors at Hogwarts, the ministry officials? Magical interference, especially on objects tied to major public events, should have sent a ripple through any detection charms in place. Was there no protocol? Did no one think to scan the cup before placing it in front of an audience of hundreds? Let us consider the nature of a portkey. It requires very specific enchantments, location, activation method, timing, and user target. Turning an ordinary item into a portkey is no simple matter if the intent is secrecy. The charm used, Portus, leaves a magical trace. In Order of the Phoenix, Dumbledore performs this spell to convert a worn-out kettle into a portkey, and it glows blue. Such magic is not invisible. So how, under the noses of Albus Dumbledore, Professor Flitwick, a Master of Charms, and others, did such a spell remain undetected? One could argue that Crouch Jr. was an expert at deceit. But expertise in disguise does not equate to invulnerability to magical detection. This was Hogwarts. possibly the most enchanted and warded location in the wizarding world. If the cup had been tampered with, surely the wards would have flared, and still nothing. Harry and Cedric touched it and vanished without a sound. When Dumbledore realizes what has happened, he shouts, "He's back! Voldemort's back!" But even in the shock of Voldemort's return, the fundamental question remains: how could such a colossal breach of security go unnoticed? There is something deeply unsettling about the negligence shown here. The magical community prides itself on rules, especially where students are concerned. Apparition lessons require ministry oversight. Time turners are locked in the Department of Mysteries. And yet a tournament involving dangerous magical tasks entrusted its final artifact to fate? No spell of detection, no curse analysis, no anti-portkey measure? Perhaps the only plausible explanation is that Crouch Jr., posing as Moody, was given unfettered access to the cup. He had already manipulated the Goblet of Fire to accept a fourth name. He orchestrated events with disturbing precision, placing the Imperious Curse on Victor Crumb, stunning Fleur Delacour, and leading Harry through a cleared maze. But this only raises the stakes of the question. If one man could operate under Dumbledore's nose with such precision, what does that say about the institution's safeguards? Dumbledore, for all his wisdom, admitted his failure in this moment. When he meets Harry after the graveyard escape, he does not protest the boy's tale. He says grimly, "I will take Harry upstairs, there is a lot to discuss." But he never addresses, at least not in the open, how such a basic safety check was skipped. One could argue that Dumbledore had grown used to working independently, trusting his own instincts, but trust in this case became a blindfold. The story becomes darker when one considers the human cost. Cedric Diggory, a promising, kind-hearted Hufflepuff, was murdered mere seconds after arriving at the graveyard. He had touched the cup believing he'd won a fair contest. Instead, he was pulled into a murder trap. The object meant to honor his triumph became the doorway to his death. Was no one accountable for this? The irony is unbearable. The Triwizard Cup, held high as a symbol of unity between three magical schools, became an instrument of evil. Its transformation was not a symbolic twist, it was a literal perversion of meaning, and not one adult intervened. Not a single magical trace was questioned, not one charm examined. If this had been a tale of muggles, perhaps the oversight would be understandable. But in a world where wands reveal truth and spells unveil lies, the silence around the cup's transformation becomes its own kind of curse. Let us recall how fiercely Hogwarts protected the Philosopher's Stone just 3 years prior. A sequence of deadly enchantments was layered over its hiding place: Fluffy, Devil's Snare, enchanted keys, a life-sized chessboard. All for an object no student knew existed. And yet the Triwizard Cup, an object every eye was trained upon, received none of this scrutiny. Where were the enchantments, the deterrents, the simple spells to verify its state? Even the Quidditch World Cup, meant for entertainment, was not without its own layers of security. There were protective enchantments, anti-apparition fields, and protocols for Muggle concealment. When Death Eaters attacked, it was seen as a major breakdown in magical security, and yet that disaster was met with more urgency and investigation than the sabotage of a student tournament. Why was this breach tolerated with such relative quiet? Harry's account, as described in Goblet of Fire, is chilling. "The cup was a portkey," he says, bloodied and shaking. There is no follow-up from ministry officials demanding an explanation. Cornelius Fudge brushes off the return of Voldemort, but even he must have known that a portkey was not an accident. Someone cast the spell. Someone set the destination. Why was that someone not immediately identified and prosecuted? Crouch Jr.'s later confession under Veritaserum provides the only glimpse into how the enchantment was performed. "I made it a portkey," he says. Simple words for a complex betrayal, but if Veritaserum reveals the truth, it should have sparked broader outrage. If a Death Eater could alter a critical magical object inside Hogwarts, what else could be changed? Was there ever a re-evaluation of magical protocols? It is worth noting how quickly the Triwizard tournament vanished after this. There were no more editions. The cup, once a symbol of magical unity, was quietly removed from future curricula. It was as if the wizarding world hoped to forget the fatal flaw, the moment where arrogance outpaced wisdom. Hogwarts rebuilt. But the memory of a shining cup, its silver light hiding deadly magic, never left Harry, nor should it leave us. The Triwizard Cup's dark transformation is more than a plot twist. It is a narrative betrayal of logic. It asks the reader to accept that the most significant object in a deadly game was the least protected. It demands belief that a school famed for its vigilance allowed a trap to bloom in full view. And worst of all, it makes Cedric Diggory's death seem not like the work of one man, but the result of collective negligence. The boy who died holding a prize deserved better, and so the cup remains a question mark in a story filled with wonder. A reminder that even in a world of magic, oversight is not immune to failure. Perhaps that's what makes this moment in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire so quietly terrifying. Not the spell, not even Voldemort, but the silence around a cup that glowed with promise and delivered a nightmare instead. Number 21, a dead student returns. And that's it. The moment was nothing short of surreal. A blinding light, the tense hush of a crowd, and then, just like that, Harry Potter appeared, clutching the lifeless body of Cedric Diggory. Dirt-covered, blood-stained, and trembling, Harry collapsed onto the grass, and the crowd stared. Not one wand raised, not a single incantation cast in alarm or defense, no protective dome, no sealing off of the area, no emergency protocol. It was as if the magnitude of what had just occurred hadn't sunk in for anyone present, and that, perhaps, is the most baffling part of all. This was the finale of the Triwizard Tournament, an event designed with layers of security, judges from multiple institutions, and observers from the Ministry itself. The task was the maze, a sealed-off battleground of enchantments and illusions. But when Harry returned with a corpse, the silence that followed was not just shock. It was negligence. Surely someone should have acted. Dumbledore, ever vigilant, McGonagall, stern and composed, Madame Maxime, cautious and proud, even the calculating Barty Crouch Jr., masquerading as Mad Eye Moody. None sprang forward with immediate magical assessment. It was as though protocol had been swallowed whole by disbelief. And what of the Ministry? Cornelius Fudge stood not 10 feet away. He was the highest magical authority present, yet all he offered was confusion and an eventual decision to deny. Circumstances are unfortunate, he might have said. But that wasn't a student who twisted an ankle on the school grounds. That was a murder victim, a 17-year-old Hogwarts champion killed under Ministry supervision. Why wasn't the scene treated like a crime scene? Why didn't anyone think to isolate Harry for questioning, not as an accused, but as a witness? The answer, perhaps, lies in the Ministry's enduring fear of the truth. The Dark Lord had returned. Harry was saying it aloud, his voice frantic, his body shaking. "He's back! Voldemort's back! He killed Cedric!" But the very utterance of that name froze the air. Voldemort was not supposed to return, and so denial was easier than confrontation. Fudge's refusal to even glance at Cedric's corpse more than once was telling. "He must have been confused," he muttered, as if confusion could raise the dead or conjure the dark mark into the sky. Still, denial does not explain the inaction. No one checked Cedric's body for dark magical residue. No one waved a wand to detect traces of the killing curse. The unforgivable Avada Kedavra leaves its mark. No wounds, no blood, only the extinguishing of life. Eyes wide open, empty, cold, was all Harry could later say. And yet the implication of that curse alone should have sent the auras into motion. But no auras came, no magical forensics team, no sealing of the cup, no spells to read its magical signature. The cup, after all, had been tampered with. It had become a portkey, redirected to a graveyard of all places. Who modified it? Who activated it? All of these questions were suspended in the haze of fear. Barty Crouch Jr., the real culprit behind the cup's transformation, was only uncovered because Harry happened to be brought to his office by Moody himself. It was chance, blind luck, that led to the truth. Had Crouch chosen to disappear instead, his deception would have remained buried. The polyjuice potion disguise might never have been uncovered. Harry might have been blamed. Worse, he might have been labelled unstable. After all, this was the same boy who claimed to have seen Voldemort a year prior. Madness, they said. Hallucinations. But if Harry was truly unstable, shouldn't the staff have ensured he was examined? The lack of containment around Harry's return is even more startling considering the broader magical dangers involved. A student appears with the corpse of another, both having vanished into a maze where portkeys were not expected. That alone suggests severe breach of magical boundaries. Was the maze searched afterward? Was any part of it scanned for forbidden magic, or was the entire field simply abandoned once the third task was declared complete? There's no indication that anyone took charge. The scene is described in the book only through Harry's point of view. Scattered shouts, sobs from Amos Diggory, Dumbledore's grave gaze. But institutionally, nothing. Why also was the cup not interrogated magically? Objects charmed into portkeys carry magical residue. The Department of Magical Transportation could have analysed its traces to determine when and how the enchantment was placed. A simple prior incantato might have revealed the last spell cast on it, but none of this is mentioned. It's as if the cup, the maze, and Cedric's corpse ceased to matter the moment Harry screamed, "He's back!" The focus shifted from what had occurred to the implications of Voldemort's return, and in doing so, every investigative step that should have followed was erased by political panic. What about the protective enchantments on the maze itself? Dumbledore was no stranger to security. The tasks were carefully constructed with magical barriers and controlled threats. If two champions vanished in a flash of portkey magic, wouldn't that be cause to lock down the field? Prevent others from touching the cup? Instead, people surged forward, touching Cedric's body, shouting, crying. No quarantine was set in place, even though this was a scene of death, and magical contamination, especially from dark magic, was a real risk. A forensic analysis might also have involved magical tracing, wands record spell activity after all. The priori incantatem effect later gave insight into Voldemort's wand, producing echoes of the victims he had killed. Surely Cedric's wand, or even Harry's, could have revealed defensive spells cast in those final moments, but no official summoned such an investigation. Fudge didn't demand wand inspection. The auras, again, were absent. One wonders if they were even informed in time. What's more disturbing is that Harry, barely 15, was left to recount the horror while visibly in shock. He had been crucioed, cut, bound to a gravestone, forced to duel the most feared dark wizard of all time, and yet his first moments back are met with neither a protective spell nor a single calming draught of peace. Madame Pomfrey wasn't even summoned until after the drama unfolded. It was trauma management at its worst, a complete failure to shield a minor from the psychological aftermath of witnessing death. It also bears questioning why no magical binding or truth-compelling charms were used to verify Harry's story. Dumbledore believed him, yes, and Snape silently assisted in verifying Voldemort's return. But that verification came days later. In that moment, surrounded by the highest magical authorities in Britain and abroad, no one insisted on clarity. Fudge preferred confusion. Crouch Sr. was already dead. The foreign delegations were stunned, and Hogwarts faculty, too loyal to question their headmaster or too shocked to act. But silence is not procedure. It would have been easy to seal off the maze, treat the cup as an artifact, and interview every person in the vicinity. Magical law has the means for this: verite serum, pensive memories, even legilimency. But none of these tools were employed at once. The initial hours after Cedric's death were the most crucial. Instead, they were wasted in hushed conversations and disbelief. The Hogwarts Express left a week later. By then, Cedric's death had been brushed aside in official records. A tragic accident, the prophet said. But no public inquiry followed. No mention of who allowed a portkey into the final task. No consequence for the ministry's lack of supervision. Dumbledore gave a eulogy, of course. "Remember Cedric Diggory," he said. "Remember him." But remembrance is not justice, and justice requires investigation. Even Rita Skeeter, who could sniff out scandal from across the continent, didn't pursue this angle. Why? Possibly because the Ministry stamped out the story before it grew teeth. Fudge's fear over Voldemort's return was so immense that he preferred letting a school death slip through the cracks than acknowledge the truth. "You are prepared to believe that Lord Voldemort has returned on the word of a lunatic boy," he barked in Dumbledore's office. But Harry wasn't a lunatic. He was a survivor. And survivors deserve more than passive stares and diplomatic silence. In hindsight, the whole scene reveals a systemic failure of magical governance. The tournament was supposed to be about unity, bravery, and magical excellence. It ended in murder, silence, and state denial. The death of Cedric Diggory should have changed everything. Instead, it changed nothing for weeks. It took the fall of the Ministry itself to bring the truth to light, and even then, no one was ever held accountable for the events of that night. No inquiry was launched, no Department of Magical Games and Sports official was suspended. Ludo Bagman vanished, conveniently. Barty Crouch Jr. was kissed by a Dementor before he could testify. And Fudge, he carried on, discrediting Dumbledore and undermining the Order of the Phoenix, while a murdered boy's memory faded into rumour. A tragic tournament accident, they said, as though it were Quidditch gone wrong. But we must remember that Harry did not simply return from a task. He returned from a battlefield. Cedric was murdered not on Hogwarts grounds, but in Little Hangleton, beside Tom Riddle's grave. That portkey had committed magical kidnapping. That graveyard was a scene of resurrection, dark ritual, and mass attempted murder. And Harry bore those scars back with him, visible and invisible. In a world where magical trace, protective enchantments, and interrogation spells are commonplace, the absence of immediate response can only be described as intentional. Whether from fear, politics, or bureaucratic paralysis, the truth was deliberately ignored. That makes Cedric not just a victim of Voldemort, but a casualty of a system too cowardly to face its own failure. And that failure began the very moment Harry Potter reappeared with a corpse in his arms, and no one asked a single question. Number 22, Voldemort's return. All the red flags were there. In the autumnal chill of Harry Potter's 4th year at Hogwarts, the castle should have been buzzing with celebration. The legendary Triwizard tournament had returned, promising camaraderie and a sense of renewed international unity. Instead, the mood gradually shifted from excitement to unease, and what unfolded should have sent warning bells ringing in every corner of the magical world. And yet no one seemed to piece it together, not Dumbledore, not Fudge, not even the Aurors who were supposedly trained to detect the tremors of rising darkness. The question that haunts the narrative is clear. With every red flag waving furiously in the wind, why did no one suspect that Lord Voldemort was moving behind the curtain? When Harry's name erupted from the Goblet of Fire, despite being underage and without submitting himself, the reaction was confusion mixed with procedural rigidity. The magical contract had to be fulfilled, they said. What they failed to consider was the breach of logic. The goblet was designed to be infallible, to reject false entries, especially those submitted after the deadline, and not by the person involved. For such a powerful magical object to be fooled, someone must have used extremely advanced and dangerous magic. That alone warranted a ministry-level investigation. Yet no one paused to ask what sort of dark magic could outwit Dumbledore's enchantments and the ancient protections of the goblet. That was the first sign of a larger game being played. As the weeks progressed, the oddities escalated. Moody, or the man believed to be Alastor Moody, was a walking contradiction. Gone was the cautious paranoia of the famed Auror, who had spent a lifetime chasing Death Eaters. In its place stood a man who offered students illegal curses for classroom demonstrations and seemed unnaturally fixated on Harry's safety. The real Moody, we later learn, was trapped in a trunk all year long, and the impostor Barty Crouch Jr. walked freely in Hogwarts drinking polyjuice potion and plotting murder. But his behavior was so erratic, so deeply off character, that one must ask, why Dumbledore or Snape, men who both knew Moody well, failed to question him deeply. Even more suspicious was the sudden reappearance of Barty Crouch Sr. at Hogwarts, a man who had been acting peculiarly in public and had mysteriously gone missing. His fragmented letters and bizarre behavior were dismissed as illness or stress, but the magical community knew that Crouch had a long and painful history with dark magic and with Death Eaters. For him to disappear, then reappear briefly, should have prompted a formal inquiry, if not a full-scale search. Instead, his erratic behavior was brushed aside until his body was discovered too late. He was coming to tell Dumbledore something, Harry recalled in horror. I know it! But the adult world had already turned its back on the trail. The first task of the tournament brought its own madness. Dragons had been chosen, and while their inclusion was ancient tradition, one must question the judgment of allowing an underage, unregistered champion to face such danger. That's not just dangerous, it's murderous, McGonagall had exclaimed. Yet she too allowed it to happen under the weight of magical contract law without pushing further into how Harry's name got into the goblet. The very danger they were acknowledging was precisely what should have drawn more suspicion towards sabotage or malicious intent. Then came the Yule Ball, an event that should have offered some relief in a tense year. But instead it further exposed cracks in the narrative. Victor Crumb, a Durmstrang champion, had been regularly sneaking off to the Forbidden Forest and, on at least one occasion, encountered Barty Crouch Sr. Harry saw this with his own eyes, though no one believed him at the time. These clues weren't scattered like puzzle pieces, they were lined up in a neat trail. And still no action was taken. The evidence didn't require divination, it required courage. In the second task, Harry discovered a powerful clue. Dobby revealed the existence of Gillyweed, and in doing so, unknowingly implicated the fake Moody, who had planted the idea in Neville's mind. Even that connection, Harry gaining illegal help from a teacher to cheat the system, should have triggered scrutiny. But again, it didn't. It was as if the adults had collectively decided not to investigate the why behind each anomaly, satisfied instead with letting the show continue. And then came Rita Skeeter, the one character seemingly determined to uncover the truth, albeit for selfish reasons. Her articles in the Daily Prophet focused on gossip, but the subtext was more disturbing. She discovered secrets about Hagrid, about Hermione, about Crouch's family that no one else was talking about. Her unregistered animagus form allowed her to eavesdrop in insect form, which was a breach of magical law. And yet no authority figure investigated how she was obtaining her information. This failure to probe deeper reflects the broader failure of the magical establishment to question what was hidden in plain sight. Crouch Sr.'s final appearance in the story, a rambling, broken man muttering about his son and trying to warn Dumbledore, was perhaps the most damning. His incoherence was not the sign of madness, but the result of years of guilt, coercion, and dark magic. His fate was sealed not because no one could help him, but because no one chose to listen until it was too late. His death was preventable, and had his words been heeded, Voldemort's resurrection might have been delayed or even stopped. Even the third task, the maze, offered numerous signs of manipulation. The very nature of the maze allowed for interference. Champions were separated, spells flew in the dark, and no eyes could see what was truly happening. Harry and Cedric's arrival at the cup together was not fate, it was by design. Barty Crouch Jr. had crafted the task to lead them exactly to the trap. And when they touched the portkey and were transported to the graveyard, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Cedric's murder was immediate, brutal, and senseless. "Kill the spare," Voldemort had said, and Wormtail obeyed. This was not a duel, it was execution. Harry witnessed the ritual that restored Voldemort's body using his own blood. He saw the Death Eaters gather. He heard Voldemort speak of betrayal, rebirth, and revenge. When Harry returned with Cedric's body, bloodied and traumatized, he brought truth with him. But it wasn't embraced. It was rejected. Cornelius Fudge, who arrived at Hogwarts that night, refused to believe the story. He claimed Dumbledore was being alarmist. "He's not back," Fudge said. "He's not." His fear wasn't rooted in disbelief. It was political. To acknowledge Voldemort's return would mean accepting a total failure of the Ministry's vigilance. It would mean the world as they knew it was about to change. So he denied it, because denial was easier than truth. Dumbledore, for all his wisdom, was also at fault. His suspicion of Moody came only after it was too late. After Harry had been returned, after Cedric had died, even then he relied on Veritaserum, a truth potion, to force Barty Crouch Jr. to confess. The confession was horrifying, every step, every manipulation, every spell cast with precision, but it was reaction, not prevention. Dumbledore had been too trusting of his old ally's identity, too willing to let things play out in the hope of revelation rather than confrontation. Snape, too, bears some of the blame. As a master of occlumency and skilled legilimens, he worked closely with Dumbledore and had been tasked with watching Draco and other Slytherins for signs of Death Eater influence. But somehow he didn't recognize that someone was impersonating a man he had worked with during the First Wizarding War. His own history with the dark arts should have attuned him to Barty's deception. But, like so many others, he focused on Harry's behavior rather than the shadow growing behind him. The entire Hogwarts staff, in fact, seemed to move through the year with blinders on. The Triwizard tournament consumed their attention, pulling focus from greater threats. They treated it like a game. A dangerous one, yes, but not a battlefront. That was the flaw, the assumption that the war was over, that Voldemort was gone. Even though Bertha Jorkins had vanished in Albania, even though the Dark Mark had been seen at the Quidditch World Cup, even though Death Eaters had re-emerged and tortured Muggles in public. If one man saw the truth clearly, it was Sirius Black. From hiding, he wrote to Harry, warning him of the signs. "If there's one thing I've learned," Sirius wrote, "it's that the trouble often starts from the people who seem the most helpful." He suspected Karkaroff, he distrusted Snape, but even he underestimated the scale of the deception. His instinct, however, was correct. Someone inside the walls of Hogwarts was working for Voldemort, and no one was stopping them. There is a tragic irony in how the magical world scoffs at divination and prophecy, yet ignores patterns when they unfold in real time. Trelawney's prophecy about Harry and Voldemort was treated as folklore by many, yet when signs pointed to its fulfillment, when Voldemort literally consumed Harry's blood to return, they refused to see the writing on the wall. It wasn't prophecy that failed, it was people. The Ministry's failure wasn't just a failure of policy, it was a failure of imagination. They couldn't fathom that Voldemort would return through a school competition. They couldn't believe he would use a boy to do it. That failure allowed him to rise. And when he did, with new power, a new body, and a vow of vengeance, the world was no longer ready. It had chosen to look away for too long. The Triwizard tournament should have been a triumph of unity. Instead, it became the crucible in which Voldemort was reborn. Every oversight, every blind eye, every denial built the staircase he climbed back to power. And in the end, it was not a lack of evidence that doomed them. It was the refusal to believe. So when the final scream echoed across the Hogwarts grounds and Harry stood clutching Cedric's lifeless body, he wasn't just mourning a friend. He was mourning a world that had failed to listen, to act, and to remember. "He's back," Harry whispered. But the world, deafened by fear, was not ready to hear him. Number 23, no anti-interference protections on the maze. The Triwizard tournament was meant to be the epitome of magical competition, ancient, legendary, and almost sacred. When Hogwarts agreed to host the event, the wizarding world watched in awe. The tasks were to be perilous, ingenious, and fair. Above all, the competition was to be a celebration of unity among magical institutions. But the third task, the labyrinth, betrays all of that, not because of what happened within, but because of what was allowed to happen from without. The very idea that Barty Crouch Jr., disguised as Mad-Eye Moody, could interfere so freely and so brazenly should trouble every careful reader. It wasn't just a crack in the tournament's logic, it was a gaping hole, and no one seemed to notice. Crouch Jr. did not merely influence the outcome, he orchestrated it. He didn't just tilt the scale in Harry Potter's favor, he built the scale, placed the weights, and told the judges it was balanced. The labyrinth, supposedly a closed and controlled magical space, should have been the most secure of the 3 tasks. Unlike the Dragon Challenge, where physical distance protected the students, or the Lake task, where time and supervision were tightly controlled, the maze was opaque. Once the champions entered, they were hidden from view. This was the perfect opportunity for manipulation, and it was taken. It is here that the illusion of fairness crumbles. The maze was growing darker with every step, Harry noted, as though the hedges had shut out the moonlight completely. But it wasn't just darkness that was growing. Behind the scenes, Crouch Jr. used that darkness as cover to transform a trial of skill into a manipulated path. He jinxed other champions, he bewitched the obstacles, he controlled who would rise and who would fall. He cast an imperious curse on Victor Crumb, using him to sabotage the competition. There was no magical alert, no judge stepped in, no wards flared in alarm. The Triwizard Cup had been turned into a portkey. This wasn't a subtle intrusion, it was an invasion. That a major magical artifact used in a world-famous tournament was so easily altered without anyone detecting it suggests catastrophic oversight. If such a modification was possible, what protections, if any, were placed around the maze? Surely an enchanted artifact that would be touched by young students should have been checked by multiple magical authorities. Was there no spell to verify the cup's integrity? Let's remember what Dumbledore himself said about magical objects. The enchantments on powerful items are not always easily undone. Yet in this case, the portkey enchantment was added so smoothly, so invisibly, that not even the headmaster or ministry officials noticed. This is no small detail. It indicates either gross incompetence or disturbing complicity. What kind of monitoring was in place? Were the wards never tested? Or, more hauntingly, were they bypassed with inside knowledge? Crouch Jr. was able to enchant the entrance to the maze so that Harry would enter last. He adjusted the turn order to ensure Harry had a better shot at success. We are told that Ludo Bagman was suspiciously pleased every time Harry did well. That line should have sparked concern. Instead, the manipulation went unchallenged. Readers might assume the judges were merely inattentive, but inattentiveness doesn't explain magical silence. Where were the security charms, the detection wards, the observers? Dumbledore had once placed powerful protections around the Philosopher's Stone, using enchantments so complex they were nearly impossible to dismantle. So why was there no similar layering of protections around a maze filled with lethal magic? The third task was the most dangerous of all. Students could die. The hedges themselves were described as alive and threatening. Surely constant magical surveillance would have been in place. But if it was, how did no one notice a Death Eater controlling the outcome? Even more illogical is the fact that a Hogwarts professor, fake or not, could operate so freely without suspicion. Moody, in his disguise, not only taught the students, but also had access to the tournament's planning. He placed the champions' names in the goblet, yes, but that deception should have triggered immediate caution. The fact that Dumbledore suspected tampering and yet allowed Moody to remain involved in the third task is baffling. Wouldn't prudence demand a complete re-evaluation of procedures? Consider that in the first task, Bagman used magic to amplify the event, and the entire school could see what was happening. Even in the lake task there were precautions, but in the maze, darkness and silence, no magical projection, no scrying orb, no enchanted mirrors, just isolation. Why create a task so closed off from oversight unless you wanted to create a perfect stage for corruption? It is as if the tournament's final challenge was designed to be tampered with. This is not simply a plot hole, it's a betrayal of logic and magical responsibility. Even Rita Skeeter, ever eager to scandalize, never mentions the obvious flaw. If a professor could compromise the task, what does that say about the ministry's oversight? Barty Crouch Sr., though already incapacitated by then, had once been in charge of law enforcement. How ironic that his own son exploited every lapse in judgment and protocol that the ministry had promised to safeguard. The champions were children, 17, maybe 18. They were placed in a maze of magical predators without visible backup, without any apparent magical fail-safe. When Harry and Cedric touched the cup together and disappeared, there should have been mass panic. But no alarms rang, no protective spell was triggered. The maze was inert to the crime it helped commit. That silence is unforgivable. After the tragedy, Dumbledore says to Harry, "There is a room in the Department of Mysteries full of love." It's a touching quote, but it also highlights what was absent from the maze: care, vigilance, and love. The Triwizard Tournament became a tool of Voldemort's return. A simple monitoring charm could have prevented it. A single layer of magical detection would have saved Cedric Diggory's life, but there was nothing. When Crumb attacked Fleur under the Imperious Curse, the maze did not reject him. The magical structure allowed cursed violence. Again, there was no signal to the judges. When Harry heard Fleur scream, he thought she was just out of reach. But in truth, she was beyond help. The maze became a silent accomplice to dark magic. Hogwarts had turned into a colosseum, and the audience was blindfolded. The Ministry's role in all this is murky. Barty Crouch Sr. was incapacitated, yes, but what of Cornelius Fudge? He was on site. He had auras, advisors, and experts with him, yet not one seemed to question the integrity of the third task. Not one demanded a magical audit of the maze. Was the cup checked before the task began? Was its enchantment certified? We are never told. The silence in the narrative mirrors the silence in the logic. The clearest example of how flawed the system was lies in Cedric's death. He died instantly, killed by Peter Pettigrew. When Harry returned with Cedric's body, the crowd was shocked, but the maze itself, the cup, the tournament, all remained unchanged. No inquiry, no magical post-mortem. Dumbledore eventually investigates, but the institution of the tournament is never questioned. The game resumed in a symbolic sense, even as the cost became unbearable. One line from the book echoes through this analysis like a curse. No one stopped to think it was odd that a fourth name had come from the goblet. That's the root of the problem. From the very beginning, the tournament was plagued with neglect. It wasn't just Barty Crouch Jr. who betrayed the children. It was the entire system. Magic may be wondrous, but without integrity, it becomes a weapon. And in the third task, it was aimed straight at a 16-year-old boy. The maze was not merely a test of courage, it became a theatre of sabotage. Every enchanted creature inside it, boggarts, blast-ended scroots, enchanted mist, was placed with precision. But while the magic inside was choreographed, the real manipulation happened from the outside. Crouch Jr. did not need to enter the maze to control it. He adjusted everything before the champions stepped in. That should have been impossible. It wasn't. When readers look back at this event, they see a heroic duel in a graveyard. But the duel was the result of systematic failure. Cedric's death was not an accident of fate. It was the logical endpoint of negligence. The maze should have been the most secure location in Hogwarts. Instead, it became the most vulnerable. And yet we are given no explanation for this lapse. Even the symbolism of the maze speaks to its failure. Mazes are supposed to represent confusion, mystery, the unknown. But in a magical setting, they must be paired with control and oversight. This was a tournament, not a death sentence, and it was meant to showcase the best of magical youth. Instead, it showcased the worst of magical bureaucracy. In the end, Harry survives, but survival is not victory. The cup, the symbol of achievement, had been turned into a lure for murder. The entire purpose of the third task was voided. "Take it," Cedric had said, "together." They had hoped for fairness, unity, but the cup was already poisoned. The moment they touched it, they ceased to be champions. They became victims of a rigged system. Number 24, no medics, no safety net. There's something chillingly absurd about the way the Triwizard Tournament was handled in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, a detail so illogical it tears a hole in the carefully woven fabric of the wizarding world. It's not the dragons, the merpeople, or the cursed goblet that defy belief. It's the silent, inexplicable absence of healers, medics, or any visible emergency response team during the 3 life-threatening tasks. In a world where a broken arm can be mended with a flick of a wand, how can there be such a gaping oversight when students are being tossed into mortal peril? The first task alone involved dragons, not illusions, not simulations, but actual fire-breathing dragons imported from Romania. The horntail that Harry faced scorched boulders into rubble and tore through metal chains like they were parchment. The book reads, "The Hungarian horntail rose into the air, wings outstretched, roaring in rage." Goblet of Fire, Chapter 20. It wasn't a game. One misstep, and Harry could have died. And yet, as he flew above the arena, dodging fiery blasts and tail spikes, the stands were filled with spectators, not a single trained healer stationed nearby. What would have happened if the horntail had knocked him out of the sky and broken his spine? Who would have run in with a medical bag and a healing spell? One might argue that Madame Pomfrey, the stalwart matron of Hogwarts, was probably present somewhere. But somewhere is not enough. We never once read that she or any medical staff was standing on the sidelines during the tournament, ready to intervene. In fact, the only immediate response Harry receives after completing the first task is a congratulatory wave from the crowd and a pat on the back from Bagman. There is no mention of an examination for burns, bone fractures, or concussion symptoms, things any Muggle sports team would have on standby for their athletes. The second task is even more baffling. The champions were required to dive into the icy depths of the Black Lake to retrieve hostages from the clutches of merpeople. Let that sink in. Teenagers submerged for an hour in near-freezing water, surrounded by creatures with sharpened tridents and a mistrust of humans. Even Fleur Delacour, a skilled witch from Beauxbatons, was rendered unconscious underwater. The text says she was very cold and looked as though she might be suffering from shock. Goblet of Fire, Chapter 26. And what did the officials do? They waited, watched, allowed her to drift to the surface on her own, as if expecting a miracle. There's no mention of warming charms being applied immediately, no one rushing to assess her vitals, no magical defibrillator to jumpstart her pulse. We don't even see a simple enervate being used. The champion was visibly injured, and still the organizers acted as though this were part of the entertainment. In a world where spells like Episci and Vulnera Sanentur can heal injuries within seconds, the fact that no one was visibly prepared for a medical emergency is not just unrealistic, it's negligent. And then there's the maze. The third task is a psychological nightmare, masked as a contest of courage. Champions were released into a sentient labyrinth that shifted paths, attacked their minds, and concealed creatures like blast-ended scroots and boggarts in its hedgerows. The maze itself had been enchanted by the professors, and yet it seemed no one thought to enchant it with any kind of monitoring system. No floating orbs to track heartbeats, no panic signal charms, just silence, darkness, madness. Victor Crumb was placed under the Imperious Curse inside the maze and used as a weapon against Cedric Diggory. Cedric, a child, barely defended himself from being cursed. Why did no one notice Crumb's strange behavior? Why wasn't there a medic immediately dispatched the moment he began acting suspiciously? Was it really expected that the judges sitting outside the towering hedges could sense what was happening inside without any magical surveillance? When Harry and Cedric touched the Triwizard Cup and were teleported to the Little Hangleton graveyard, they left the boundaries of the tournament, but the officials didn't realize anything was wrong for several long minutes. Dumbledore, ever watchful, only began to sense that something was amiss after a suspicious amount of time had passed. Cedric was murdered. Harry returned, bloodied, barely alive, trembling, sobbing over Cedric's lifeless body, and yet no emergency team came charging in. No magical medics, no psychic healers. Just stunned silence, and eventually Madame Pomfrey, somewhere backstage. What's alarming isn't just the danger, it's the casual acceptance of it. The Triwizard tournament was supposedly reinstated with new safety measures, according to Dumbledore. But what were those measures? Certainly not medical preparedness, surely not magical tracking charms. It seems that the entire safety plan hinged on the hope that Dumbledore could sense danger and react in time from the judges' table. But even Dumbledore, with all his wisdom, could not see through maze walls or penetrate the depths of the lake. Was the safety of the champions really entrusted to chance? Let us not forget that the champions were children. Harry was 14, Fleur and Victor were 17, Cedric 18, teenagers made to fight dragons, challenge hostile aquatic beings, and brave a labyrinth that induced madness. Even in the Muggle world, sports involving physical risk like boxing or football are heavily regulated. Paramedics are on site, coaches can call a halt, referees can intervene. But in the Wizarding world, the champions were essentially thrown into the void and told to survive. We know that the Wizarding world has the means for emergency care. In Half-Blood Prince, Katie Bell is cursed by a dark artifact and is immediately flown by Thestral to St. Mungo's Hospital. When Arthur Weasley is bitten by Nagini in Order of the Phoenix, he is rushed to a secure ward where he is treated with both potions and charms. Magical medicine exists and is advanced, so why was none of it visible during the tournament? It seems that spectacle triumphed over safety. The Triwizard tournament wasn't just a competition, it was a show. Ministers, school heads, foreign dignitaries, and families all sat in the stands, cheering while children risked death. The absence of healers might not have been an oversight, it might have been deliberate. Perhaps the organizers didn't want to spoil the authenticity of danger, but if that's the case, it reflects a deeper rot in wizarding culture, a willingness to risk lives for tradition. Even Rita Skeeter, known for her sensationalist reporting, never mentioned the lack of medical staff. But then again, her articles were more focused on gossip than ethics. It is strange that Hermione, so often the voice of reason, didn't raise the issue either. Perhaps, like the rest of the wizarding world, they were numbed to the absurdity. Perhaps danger had become so normalized that no one noticed its proximity until it took a life. One could argue that some protective spells were used. The book mentions that the champions were checked for cheating, and spells like Prior Incantato were used to inspect wands. But not once does the text suggest the use of diagnostic charms to assess a champion's physical or mental state. Why weren't spells like Diagnosio or Sanentor built into the infrastructure of the tasks? Would it have been so difficult to include a magically summoned stretcher or a healer's flu station nearby? Let us revisit Fleur's condition after the second task. She was so disoriented that she had to be helped out of the water. If she had remained underwater just a minute longer, she might have drowned. Merpeople were ordered not to interfere, and the champions had to rely solely on themselves. What if the gillyweed had worn off early? What if the bubblehead charm faltered? Were the judges prepared to explain to a parent why their child didn't resurface? Even the crowd seems unbothered by the possibility of tragedy. The audience cheered when Harry outflew the dragon, but would they have screamed if he had fallen? Would they have demanded justice if Cedric had been maimed instead of killed? There is something darkly voyeuristic in the way the Triwizard tournament is structured, and it's compounded by the lack of basic life-saving preparedness. After Cedric's death, no inquiry was made public, no committee formed to investigate security flaws. The Triwizard tournament was quietly retired once again, but not because it failed the children. It was because Voldemort had returned. The absence of emergency protocol went unaddressed. No one was punished. No one even apologized. The wizarding world may possess magical wonders that outshine Muggle science, but in moments like these, it is stunningly primitive. The ethical frameworks that safeguard human life are absent. The logic that governs common sense is bent, if not broken, and the Triwizard tournament, for all its prestige and glory, stands as a grim example of magical negligence. So the question remains, if Harry had not survived the graveyard, if Fleur had drowned, or if Cedric had lost his mind in the maze, who would have taken responsibility? Would there have been memorials? Would Madame Pomfrey have been told to do better next time? Or would it have all been swept under the magical rug, as so many things are in the wizarding world? The most unsettling part is not that there were no emergency medics, it's that no one seemed to notice.